is Sean Bonner, and I run something called Metro Blogging. So I guess we'll go ahead and start this. So this is about sort of local media and giving it back to people, or sort of people taking it back, or whatever. So I thought I'd start this off kind of going back a little bit, like where kind of this all came from. So originally, with media, there was nothing but local, really, because that was all you could talk to. So no matter who you wanted to talk to, the only people you could talk to were those who were around you, sort of in earshot or eyeshot. But as things grew, that got much bigger and quicker, really fast. And once media was in more than just right around the corner, people realized they could make money with it, and started figuring out more ways to do that. Sorry about that. So before too long, local wasn't really the best thing. People needed to figure out how to get people's attention and get them reading their stuff rather than everybody else's stuff. And so national or global news became the most important thing right away. Bigger headlines, more important stuff, to get people to buy one newspaper over something else. Meanwhile, reading global, national news didn't really affect you too much on your day-to-day life. So local was still really the most important thing that people were getting out of the papers. With any kind of business, there's lots of trying to figure out how to make more money with it, how to do better things with it, and lots of consolidation and syndication, which basically means that newspapers would try to decide that rather than having 10 reporters working on something, they would have one reporter working on it and then print that around in other places. So someone writing an article in Los Angeles, somebody writing an article in New York, somebody writing an article in Chicago. It was much better just to have one person write all three of those and skip the problems. Basically what that meant was local didn't make any money, and national and global was where the dollars were at. So the big solution to this from a local standpoint was supposed to be alternative weeklies. I think that there's alternative weeklies all over Europe as well. There's alternative weeklies all over in the US. And these are supposed to be like the local replacement to local newspapers. The problem with this is that they're still newspapers, there's still high overhead, there's still staff, there's still lots of costs involved with it, and for the most part, these things pretty much suck. They don't take any kind of stances because they're worried about advertisers, they're worried about problems affecting overhead, and so they're bland, and they sort of stay, in a nice safe area. Luckily, the internet came along and changed a bunch of that. So once the internet was around, people started talking to each other, and they weren't too worried about overhead with talking to each other, and they really like to talk to each other. And the more they talked to each other, the more they definitely started talking about all kinds of things. And eventually, people started talking to people who were actually nearby them, as opposed to just anybody who would listen. The more people talked about things, the more blogs became the best way for people to do that. Check my next slide here. Yes, excellent. Okay. Right. So one of the biggest complaints with these earlier forms of media was because there were so many people involved with before something was actually printed or published. Writers, editors, advertisers, everything else. You didn't really know what was the story behind what you were reading. Was that actually the person's opinion, or whether some other things sort of going on with this. But with blogs, all of the biases were right out in public, and people were very, very happy to flaunt their opinions around about all of it. And the more people started talking, the more sort of power was given to the individual, as opposed to early on with this. The only people you could talk to were those who could actually hear you. But now you could talk to anybody who would listen. And so if you actually had something interesting to say, or you said it enough, you would definitely sort of get some sort of power in that. You have an audience, and once you and your friends were doing this, then suddenly it's a much more impressive situation than just you talking. So as people started grouping up and realizing that there was some power in that, it wasn't just people that were grouping up, but also blogs themselves. This sort of led to the idea of blog networks. Lots of people writing for lots of different blogs, and lots of blogs sort of backing each other up in one way or another. So, which kind of brings me to the local thing. So, jumping back just a little bit here, that was sort of where we're at now, but this is back a couple of years. Back in middle of 2003, a friend and I were in Los Angeles. We both live in Los Angeles, and we were discussing all of what I just kind of ran through, and about how local media pretty much sucked across the board. And we were looking around and realizing that trying to find something as simple as a restaurant review was near impossible, because any kind of local newspapers, alt weeklies, everything, they would review a restaurant by talking about what color the walls were, how many people were working there at a time, how easy it was to get a table, but they would never actually say whether the food was any good. And then we would see that restaurant was advertising in the papers as well. Or same thing, local political issues. Nothing media-wise would take a stand on anything, but we were finding plenty of people taking stands on things on blogs. And so we decided that simply because it was a site that we really wanted to read, we would go ahead and pool a bunch of these people and get a bunch of bloggers in Los Angeles to all write for one site. And it would sort of be like the cool blog resource of all things local and happening in Los Angeles. And so we created blogging.la. And this is a really horrible Wayback Machine image of it. There's that dumpster. There's supposed to be even more trash up in the top. So anyway, we created this thinking that it would be cool for us to read in Los Angeles, and that would kind of be the end of it. But right away, we started getting lots of emails from people in other cities saying that they really liked this idea, and they really wish there was some sort of local resource like this in their city. And so then we sort of shifted the idea from just working on Los Angeles to figuring out how to do this around the world. And we came up with Metroblogging. So at this point, Metroblogging is in just under 60 cities all around the world. We have over 700 bloggers writing for Metroblogging sites in one way or another. And it definitely has changed across the board. Like every time we think that it's about one thing and headed one direction, something changes with it. So we thought that this was all really cool, and people were talking about their cities, and it was this little thing, and they just happened to all be connected by being a part of the same network, until major news started happening in one of the cities where we already had a blog, and suddenly all of the traffic and all of the readers that we had from the entire network, rather than reading the individual cities, were all pointing their readers and people to one specific city. So, people in Paris and people in Tokyo were reading to find out something going on in some small city on the other side of the world. A pretty good example of this is New Orleans. Back in 2005, this hurricane came and destroyed the city. And we had bloggers there who were pretty much the source of information coming out of New Orleans. Major media, CNN, CBS, all the big U.S. companies and global companies as well, were sending just their standard reporters to try to cover what was going on in the city. But these were people who were detached. didn't really have any sort of vested interest in what was happening in the city. You know, they were just sort of reporting, oh, you know, everything's falling apart, that's that. Meanwhile, the bloggers who were there had a totally different approach to it, because this was something that, you know, their livelihood was based on. So people were posting photos of what was happening in their front yard. They're posting photos of what was happening in their neighborhoods, and they were correcting the major media. You know, CNN would run a photo of water filled over first floors of houses and report that some area of town was flooded, and then our blogs would say, actually, that's not that part of town at all. That's a stock photo from this other section of town, and I'm standing in that part of town. It's not flooded at all. And that's the sort of thing that only people who live in a city and know the city and are vested in the city can do. And so this became pretty interesting, and it wasn't just as it was going on. It's still, you know, follow up and rebuilding and everything. The people in New Orleans were definitely the best source of information for anything happening in New Orleans. Here's a post from one of the authors, like a week and a half after all this goes down, and they're talking about how all these news, you know, they're just over it already. They're on to the next thing to try to pay attention to. Meanwhile, these people are still trying to figure out how to put their lives back in order. We saw this again in other cities. We saw it in London with 2 bombings. We saw it in Bangkok with the coup. Bangkok was interesting because the military coup attempt that went down in 2006, they shut off all media, thinking that they would stop this story from happening. And so our bloggers like walked down the street with their phone cams and took pictures and put them up. So we had the story up on Metroblogging Bangkok almost 6 hours before CNN had any kind of information about what was going on. So when CNN was reporting it, they were saying, you know, we don't know what's going on. We don't know how many people have been killed. We don't know, you know, we just know that something crazy is happening. And we had photos of soldiers like asleep in their tanks because it was completely bloodless. There wasn't anything really terrible going on other than somebody evicting somebody else, basically. The most recent example of this is what was going on end of last year in Pakistan. You know, depending on which news you were reading, it was either martial law or special emergency. And the same thing, the Pakistani government, they were cutting off as much news as they could. They were cutting off internet connections. They were cutting off, well, their way to cut off internet connections was to cut off phone lines. They thought that everybody was on dial-up, so if they stopped any sort of incoming or outcoming phone lines, then there wouldn't be any kind of internet problems. I'm not sure how they missed DSL, but they did, and so our bloggers went to coffee shops and continued posting pretty much nonstop daily basis about what was going on, and for a good 2.5 months or so, we have 3 blogs in Pakistan: Lahore, Karachi, and Islamabad, and they were nonstop, like the best source of information coming out of the country. And so the more that we were doing this, and the more interesting this got, the more other like big media companies tried to figure out, how they could get a piece of that. And so one example is AOL. AOL tried to copy what we were doing in New Orleans. Of course, there's a really big difference between growing a community and just sort of putting one up and expecting it to exist. And so where we had people who were contributing to the sites because it was something they were passionate about, they were writing reviews of places or about things that they actually really cared about and they really wanted to tell people about. AOL just hired people and used standard methods of getting content that they would use for anything else. They hired people, assigned them a story, gave them some money, and said, "Here, write this." And so the difference between somebody writing about something that they're just writing to meet a deadline versus people writing about things that they really genuinely care about is really obvious. And as you can see from this this post, which was the last one on Blogging New Orleans, September 14th, 2007, There was no comments. There was no anything. The site's pretty much abandoned. And there's just no community for it. So they kind of gave up on that whole idea pretty quickly. Regular media, newspapers and things that we sort of started all these blogs to counteract, also tried to copy a lot of what we're doing, more so by using tools than by trying to, mimic exactly what we were up to. But they're still, running through editors. They're still running through the general newspaper system. So in some steps it's better, but in a lot of steps it's still the same as it was before. So this all started with Metroblogging in middle 2003, and we've been doing it ever since then. Like I said, we're in over 60 cities now, and it just gets more interesting every time. Every city we put up, every new place, everything new that happens, and we never really thought that it would do what it's doing now, but it's interesting to see where it'll go next, which may be someplace. That's it. Any questions?
Okay. So I would have a question. You were telling me a story about trying to get a Metroblogging network going on in Iran. Could you tell a little bit about that? Because I think that's interesting because of the language problems and that stuff.
Yeah, well, so really early on in all of this, when we decided that people were getting in touch with us and we wanted to do other cities, we decided that the best thing to do would be to just pick big cities. Like, we were in Los Angeles, so the best thing to do is pick other big cities and just kind of replicate what we had done, and that should probably work fine. So we picked just a handful of major cities, New York, London, whatever, and started emailing people, Googling around, trying to find blogs written by people in those cities, try to find out what was going on, and email those people and show them what we were up to. And it didn't really work out so well. It was sort of the difference of us saying, like, hey, look at this cool thing we're doing. You should come do it as well. And so we didn't really realize what was going on with that until we thought, like, okay, well, these people are emailing us saying they really want this in their city, so maybe we should stop trying to think that we know what we're doing and just trust the people who are emailing us and already get what we're up to, and just give them the tools to figure out how to do it in their city as well. So most of the cities that we've been into after like the first 5 or 6 cities are all because people got in touch with us. So people got in touch with us from different places in Iran, Tehran specifically, also some folks from Iraq and other sort of Middle Eastern areas. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to get any of those sites up. We get people who say they really like what we're doing, they really want to do it, they want to help translate stuff, they want to do things in their own language, we want to give them everything we possibly can, and then they sort of disappear. Basically, people email us, we back and forth, we get everything set up, we get the site set up, hand them keys, and then they just stop emailing us and we don't know how to get in touch with anybody. And so far we have we have a Dubai blog, and that's about as close as we've gotten to anything. But we do get interest, so hopefully we'll figure that out. All right, great.
Thanks.
Thanks.